Well, welcome to you all again. I want to begin with a couple of announcements. This coming Saturday, January 22nd, the Reformed Institute has its annual convocation, and it has a speaker and on a topic that is very relevant to this particular adult education class. Brian Blunt, African-American, distinguished figure in our church, actually, a New Testament scholar, taught at Princeton for many years. He's now the president of the Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Richmond, and he's going to speak on a topic that I, in particular, will find, I think, very interesting, and I hope some of the rest of you will, and that is the liberation trajectory of the Reformed tradition. And I think that's an interesting topic to hear an African-American talk about, because I think the Reformed tradition has a very checkered history when it comes to African Americans in particular. So I'm going to be very interested to hear what he has to say about that. That's been publicized well in our congregation. It starts at 9:30 on Saturday morning. I commend that to you. I also want to just make you aware of the fact that there's another event coming on January 27th, which I believe is sponsored by the Black Caucus in our presbytery. I'm not certain about that, but this is an evening starting a 2-hour presentation with discussion starting at 6:30 in the evening. I have to register in advance on the theology of Gay Wilmore, who is our topic for this morning. So if you get interested in Gay Wilmore, I think this could be a very interesting session. And I'm personally signed up for it, but I'm maybe Scott, if you can just take note, it would be a good idea, I think, if we could make available through our own communication tools, make it easier for people to sign up for that if they're interested. That's 6:30 on the 27th.
Bruce, are both these on Zoom?
Both are on Zoom, absolutely. They're both on Zoom. These are Zoom meetings. Today, I'm going to talk about yet another figure in the ongoing drama, if you will, of the history of the Black Presbyterian experience in the United States. Those of you who were here in the first session know that I talked about Henry Highland Garnett, very important figure in Black history, and in particular, Black Presbyterian history, but even more sort of the history of the abolitionist struggle in the 19th century. So the issue for Henry Highland Garnett was how to get rid of slavery. And I talked about that. Last week, I talked about a figure who comes later, Francis Grimke, pastor for many years of the 15th Street Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. In his lifetime, the great struggle was Jim Crow policies, laws, and so forth. He was a truly eloquent voice for the Black community in resistance to the many problems with Jim Crow. So I call that to your attention simply as background, because today we're going to talk about somebody who comes yet farther in the evolution of the Black experience in the United States, and that's a man called Gay Roud, and he was normally known in the church as Gay Wilmore, 20th century, 21st century figure. Interestingly, he lived almost 100 years. He was born in 1920, and he died in 2020, just a short time ago, just a few months before his 100th birthday. Didn't quite make it to the 100th, the centennial year, but he had a long, therefore, life. And he confronted yet another different challenge, a very different challenge from the figures that I've discussed before. Not segregation as such, although he grew up in segregation, and I'll talk about his encounter with segregation. But he came to maturity in the 1950s and 60s, and his career then extends throughout the rest of the 20th century and even into the early 21st century. But in that period, the great challenge was the church's response to the movement for desegregation. The church's response for the great movement to begin and try to undo segregation. And of course, I'm talking there about what oftentimes we think of as the civil rights struggle. It's more complicated than that, but That's the name which oftentimes is put on it. He was, I'm going to just preview of what's coming. He was the church's point man, the Northern Church's point man in the civil rights struggle, and was the sidekick of the side man to, the wingman to, if you will, Eugene Carson Blake, who was president of the National Council of Churches, the leading figure in the Presbyterian bureaucracy at that point, who made a conscious decision to commit the church to active support of the efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. And as a Black man, Wilmore was in a position to be a crucial mediator in that period. He grew up in the Jim Crow era, as I said, but came to maturity at the time when that was being directly challenged, and that thrilled him, by the way. That just thrilled him. But finally, we were getting a direct challenge, and it thrilled him even more that at least some parts of the church, the white church, were prepared to respond positively to that effort. And a very important part of this story in the background, I'm maybe not going to say enough about it, but I will be talking about it more next week, and that is, this is the period in which, and I want to stress really for the first time, Black Presbyterians begin to be taken seriously, their views begin to be taken seriously by white Presbyterians. And they begin to enter positions of power and influence. And Gay Wilmore himself is one of those figures. Let me just say parenthetically, the fact that we've got to the point now where somebody like Brian Blunt can be president of a major seminary is a sort of testimony to how far we've come in that regard. But for reasons I'm going to get into, that would have been very, very unlikely, if not impossible, in Gay Wilmore's, especially in his the sort of the central years of his adult life. He had a different sort of career from either of these figures. I hope you see they're all clergy in one way or another, but they have very different careers. Henry Hiley Garnett was principally a kind of social activist. He was a pastor, but boy, he was out there in the struggles of the Black community all the time, constantly providing leadership in a way that rivaled at times Frederick Douglass, which is saying a lot. Grimke was more the churchman, very involved in the church's life, and yet constantly engaged in other things, particularly the NAACP. In the case of, and both of those, by the way, were pastors, spent most of their careers, their professional lives in pastoring churches. Wilmore was a different kind of figure. He was a pastor briefly, but only very briefly. As far as I can tell, just 3 years at the very beginning of his ministerial career. And then he was moved out of that and up, some would say, into the denominational hierarchy, into the bureaucracy, and spent a good part of his career, about 20 years, working as an official of the Presbyterian Church in a variety of roles. And then in the latter part of his life, the last roughly 30 years, 25 years of his professional career, he became an academic and taught in various theological seminaries, and became, I think, especially as his career evolved, a noteworthy figure as an academic in the world of ideas. So that's the kind of person we're talking about. Today, I will be discussing his life and times in two parts. The first part of my presentation will have to do with the details of his life. Let me just say parenthetically, I always think when you're dealing with figures who have important ideas to convey, it is very important to get a sense of who they were. Otherwise, the ideas just float in abstraction. In the case of all of these people, there's drama in their lives, and the ideas that they espouse are related to the drama in their lives. So that's just a parenthesis about my method. I'm going to be talking about his life in the first part of these remarks. And then in the second part, I'm going to be talking about his ideas, particularly on one key issue, which was at the center of the great struggle in the Black community in the latter part of the 1960s. By the way, the issue that I'm going to be talking about, which has to do with Black power, is an issue which resonates to this day. You'll as I talk about that, I think you'll begin to get a sense of the way in which events back then have a kind of connection, an intimate connection with things that are going on in our own time. As I said, Gay Wilmore was born in 1920. His parents, he was born in North Philadelphia. His parents were, I would say sociologically, you would characterize them as lower middle class. His father was an office clerk, had that kind of job. He was not a manual laborer. By the way, there's a wonderful, in one of his books, there's a wonderful sermon that he preached, which on Father's Day is a testament to his father and how much his father shaped his own identity and roots. And he makes a very interesting point. He said, my father was not a manual laborer, but he was a laborer. I thought that was very interesting. Not a manual laborer, but a laborer, somebody who had all of his life to work for a living, and he worked hard. And his mother even more so, because she worked as a domestic. So that's the kind of world out of which he's coming. And he, like Grimke, remember I talked about Grimke just sort of treasuring the fact that he was able to be part of an intact Black family. Well, once again, we have a man, Wilmore, who says a lot about how much he appreciates the fact that his parents loved each other, they were devoted to one another, and they spent their lives trying to provide a good environment for their children, for their children to grow up. His father, interestingly enough, was one of those Black men who enlisted in the military and went off and fought in World War I. If you were here last week, you will remember Grimke's sharp criticism of World War I and his claim that Blacks really didn't have any place fighting in that war. He came back as a veteran of that war. And Gay Wilmore says, my father came back from that war with a very strong sense of civic duty and civic awareness. Very interesting. Out of the war, civic duty and civic awareness. He said, for all of his life, he was somebody who was out there in the community, trying to provide leadership to the Black community, mainly in all kinds of ways. And he said, one of the things my father was proudest of was the fact that he was able to be instrumental in the creation of the first Black American Legion post in Eastern Pennsylvania. And he said, that's just typical of my father. Another thing that he says is that my father was very active in making sure that Black kids went to school. And in that particular community, apparently there was a sort of checkered situation. Some school districts were segregated, some were not. He says in our particular district, they were desegregated, they were not segregated, and therefore my parents in particular went through the community insisting to people that it was very important that all those Black kids get to school. And he said, one of the great things about my memories of that period is those white ladies, that's the phrase, those white ladies who were nice to us at school. He said, I don't take that for granted at all. And he said, that was a very important part of my own development, that I took to schooling, I took to education, in part because of the way those white ladies treated us. Another memory, however, he has from the earliest years of his life is a very striking one. He says, we lived in what basically was a ghetto. He said that term wasn't used then, but that clearly was what it was. It was a pretty impoverished area. And he says, that's where all the Blacks had to live. We didn't have any choice. And he said, right next to that ghetto was another area of very poor housing. And he said, I remember as a little kid, he says, I still can remember this like it was yesterday, the Eastern European, after the First World War, the influx of Eastern European immigrants who could not speak any English. And he said, we began to play with their kids. We were playing together. And he said, of course, they didn't know any English. And he said, so they began to learn English from us, playing with us. But he said, I also never will forget the first time one of them used the word nigger. And he said that was just kind of a turning point. He said, because once it was very clear that race consciousness was seeping into the minds of those little kids who could barely speak English, although they spoke English better, excuse me, than their parents. And he said, once that happened, it was very clear that there was a division developing among us kids. And he said, from that point on, there were fights all the time. He said the Black boys and the white boys in particular were at each other's throats. He said you couldn't walk through a certain neighborhood without expecting to be beat up. He said, that's another memory I have from school days. And he said, once those Eastern European families began to learn English, get a little prosperity, they quickly moved away. They quickly moved out from the impoverished area next to the one where we lived. He also tells an interesting story And I think this is such a revealing story about how the family became Presbyterians. We were not initially Presbyterians. He says we were initially Baptists, Black Baptists. But he said, my father, being such an active member of the community, became aware of the fact that there was a church that was being vacated by whites, and it turned out to be a Presbyterian church. And that white church, the place that it was clearly white flight, they were on their way out. They were moving to a more prosperous area where I guess the white Presbyterians lived. And he said they were trying to figure out what to do with that building, and they offered that building to my father and a bunch of his friends, if on the condition that they would create a Presbyterian church. And he said they jumped at the chance, and that's how we became Presbyterians. And he said once my parents moved into that church and learned what Presbyterians were like, he said they liked it a lot, and they embraced sort of the larger system, if you will, the larger package of Presbyterians by virtue of their access to this building, by the way, for which they were grateful. He said they were very grateful. And as far as I know, he said that building was just given to them. They didn't have to, he said, I think I would have heard about it if they had to raise money to buy that building. He was a good student, went off to what became, it wasn't at the time, called Lincoln University. Lincoln College, which eventually became Lincoln University. You've heard me mention that before. Lincoln University, Lincoln College, Lincoln University plays a very important role in Black history, especially the Black history of what came to be known as the talented 10th, the Black bourgeoisie, as Fraser called it. And it was a Presbyterian institution. It was an institution created for Blacks by Presbyterians. That, you may recall, was where the Grimke brothers got their higher learning, at least the beginning of it. It was called at the time in the first part of the 20th century in particular, it was known as the Black Princeton, as the place that Presbyterians had created for Blacks. He went there and was enrolled and began his course of studies. He was eventually to graduate from Lincoln University, and in fact, not only get a BA from Lincoln University, but also to get a BD, as it was called then, the professional degree for clergy. They had a theological school there. But that was interrupted by the war and his being drafted. He was drafted and fought in the European theater in the Second World War, and served with distinction. Came back, and by the way, he says at one point, that experience in the war was very helpful to me in thinking about the issues that I confronted eventually as a student of theological ethics. He, for a while in his career, was an ethicist, and he thought the experience of fighting in the war was very, very useful to him, very helpful to him in that regard. He got his BD in Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1947 at the age of 27, and he got his BA in 1947 and his BD in 1951, and promptly was ordained to the ministry in the Presbyterian Church. He served for 3 years as the pastor of the Second Presbyterian Church in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And one of the things he talks about in that period, he said, I spent a lot of my time desegregating the schools there. He said, I was chairman of a committee that was responsible for challenging the segregated policies of the schools there, and we were successful. He said, one of my children was one of the earliest Black students to go. Now, this is in the 1950s, keep in mind, in the North, in Westchester, Pennsylvania. I think partly as a result of that activism, he was, keep in mind, he's a very young man, just beginning his ministerial career, albeit with the background of the military service. He was asked to serve and did, in fact, serve beginning in the mid-1950s, 1954, as a member of the staff of the PCUSA Board of Christian Education. Board of Christian Education, which had a sort of subdivision within it, the Division for Social Education and Action. This was the place where the activists, if you will, gathered and did their work. And at that same time, let me also say, he began graduate study in theological ethics, first at Drew University. That's important to note. That's a Methodist institution, not a Presbyterian one, not a Reformed one, I might add, a Methodist institution. And later he didn't finish it there, but he completed his doctoral work at Temple University in the School of Religious Studies there. And when the civil rights struggle began to erupt, Montgomery bus boycott and all that stuff, Martin Luther King begins to become a figure of note. He says, the first time I heard about that, my heart was thrilled. I was thrilled. I saw this was really a great thing. He said, for a long time, he said, I knew there had been earlier attempts to do this, but for a long time, Blacks had been trying to sort of nudge segregation. And for various reasons it had failed. And he said, I had the sense that because of the way the country was developing, this might be the moment when something significant would happen. And he said, the more that became evident, the more evident it was to me that the churches needed to respond constructively. In 1959, he's not really to the heart of his career as an activist yet, but in 1959, he had completed part of his doctoral study, but not all of it, was asked to join the faculty of the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, Presbyterian Seminary, where he taught Christian ethics as an assistant professor from 1959 to 1963. Now, people at Lewinsville, I think, have a special reason for taking interest in that. Gary Pinder was a theological student in that period at Pittsburgh Seminary. And he told me in a conversation we had last year that one of the main reasons why he was motivated to be an activist, and that's the way Gary thought of himself, motivated to be an activist, and in particular why he and a bunch of other students from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary went to Selma in the great moment of crisis there, was because of the influence of Gay Wilmore. He said Gay Wilmore was a young guy then, full of vibrancy, full of passion, devoted to the cause of civil rights. And he said you could hardly not be affected by his teaching. Gary told me that throughout his ministry, he was oftentimes thinking about the ideas that he had first encountered there with Gay Wilmore. Because of his commitment to the cause of civil rights and various other causes to which he was committed, in the early 1960s, he was invited to become, and this is a very important sort of moment, not just for him, but for the life of the church, he was invited to become the first executive director of a newly created organization, the Commission on Religion and Race of the UPUSA, the United Presbyterian Church in the USA. And that was precisely at the moment when the churches were gearing up to become activist in a variety of different ways, to mobilize clergy in particular, to go south, to be involved in those various direct action campaigns, but also to get support throughout the country for the passage of the civil rights legislation. And you may recall when I talked about this last year, if you were here, I said that Hubert Humphrey said, who was the main person responsible for the shepherding that legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the great Civil Rights Act, through the Congress, that it probably would not have happened had it not been for the support from the churches. And above all, he meant the white churches in that regard. And the UPUSA was at the center of that. In particular, Eugene Carson Blake as the titular leader of the church, who was also at the time the president of the National Council of Churches, and his right-hand man was Gay Wilmore. Gay Wilmore was to remain the executive director of the Commission on Religion and Race for about 10 years, from 1963 when he took that position through 1972. I'm going to talk a lot in the second part of my presentation about the evolution of his thought during that period. It's fascinating, and it really does, I think, provide really important, valuable background to some of the things we're confronting today. And let me say that evolution was fueled in part by his encounter with the phenomenon, the idea, the set of ideas, the set of figures who advocated the ideas of Black power. Black power was the sort of next thing that he confronted. After he had confronted the Martin Luther King philosophy of nonviolence and all that that entailed, and responded to it with great enthusiasm, and thought the churches need to ally themselves with that cause, and was astonished, frankly. He said at one point, I was astonished that the white leadership of many of these mainline denominations actually were responding positively. He said there'd been so much resistance over the years, so much evasion over the years, that I was astonished when this moment of challenge came and they responded as vigorously as they did. But then comes the Black Power issue in the latter part of the 1960s, and he becomes part of a group called the National Conference of Black Churchmen, who are in their own way advocates of Black Power. Let me say that again. The National Conference of Black Churchmen, formed in 1966, who are advocates of Black Power and strong proponents of Black Power ideas in the life of the mainline Protestant churches. The struggle over that, and especially over the struggle over two things. The National Conference of Black Churchmen eventually advocated reparations and took up the cause of reparations as something which was essential to the Black struggle. And the famous support that our denomination gave to Angela Davis's defense fund led to very strong backlash in the mainline Protestant churches. And that backlash was very, very discouraging to Gay Wilmore. And I think it's one of the reasons why he left you might say, the activist portfolio and moved into the academy. He left the work of the Commission on Religion and Race in 1972, had been invited several times to accept academic appointments, and finally did, and began really a quite distinguished academic career from that point on, from the early 1970s through the late 1990s. Let me just give you a list. And by the way, the interesting thing about this list, he was in great demand and would move from one place to another. Started out at Boston University School of Theology, a Methodist institution. That was his first appointment after he left the denominational office. And then to Colgate Rochester, a Baptist institution. Later, New York Theological Seminary, an Episcopal institution in New York City. And then finally, the place that he wound up, excuse me, and stayed the longest, the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. And let me just say, in addition to that, he became a kind of, over time, a kind of eminence, not just in the Presbyterian Church, but in the sort of wider world of particularly Black intellectuals, Black activists in the mainline churches. I'll talk about the difference between the mainline churches and the historic Black churches a little bit later. He also became very active in that period, and I think this is not surprising, in the World Council of Churches and its campaign against racism, and became a very good friend of Desmond Tutu, among others, and Alan Bosak, the two great leaders of the church struggle in South Africa. Some of you may be aware of the Belhar Declaration. He was delighted to see that finally finally be embraced by the churches, that cause being embraced by the churches in that explicitly doctrinal way. He chaired one of the more important World Council of Churches commissions on racism. Theology and racism came under the Faith and Order Commission. The other thing I want to say finally about his career before moving on to the challenges of very, very great importance strategically that the Black movement as a whole confronted, I want to tell you just briefly a story about his involvement in something which I think is very important in Presbyterian history. Some of you who heard me talk about sort of doctrinal issues in the Presbyterian Church will remember that I've characterized the Confession of 67 and the embrace of a book of confessions as opposed to focusing single-mindedly on the Westminster Confession of Faith, as a very important development in not just in American Presbyterianism, but Presbyterian history generally. That's the foundation of our church life to this day, the theological foundation. He was one of the members of the commission that drafted the Confession of 67. And he said the following about it, and I was surprised to read this because I, up to this point, was basically pretty much a fan of the Confession of 67. He said, predictably, I was the only person of color in that group. He said there were a bunch of white guys. The only person of color, he said they were wise guys. They were wise, not wise guys, but wise guys, wise people. They were wise and learned and so forth. And he compliments many of them in that regard. They knew their theology and so forth. But he said, I was the only person in that whole group who had any sense of the experience of people of color, not just in this country, but throughout the world. And he said, he said, keep in mind the setting. We're meeting starting from the late 1950s, moving through the 1960s. We're meeting as this explosion is taking place in the wider country. And he said, I would explain to them from time to time, this is of importance for this confession. He said, think about the historic confessions of the church. They're always a response to some big crisis that's taking place in the wider society. And he said they would listen to me politely and chat with me at coffee hour. And he said, basically, they ignored me. Now, that's not quite true. There is a passage in the Confession of 67 which talks about the need for racial reconciliation. It's a nice statement. But his comment about that was the following. He said, predictably, insofar as they talked about race, it was all about reconciliation, nothing about justice. Nothing about justice. And he said, particularly as we moved toward the conclusion of that process, there were riots taking place, and there was a ferment in the country with regard to issues of poverty and economic justice. And he said, they sort of touched on that, but basically their concern, mainly as white people, was reconciliation, not justice. So that's a very sobering comment on a very important, not just document, but experience. In his last years, Gay Wilmore was in retirement in this area, living in this area, Ingleside, Rock Creek. And I've oftentimes thought, particularly in the last couple of years, as I've been reading about Gay Wilmore and thinking about his thought, we missed a real opportunity here at Lewinsville. We should have had him speak. Gary knew him well, of course, and I'm a little bit surprised that Gary did not press that on us. But we missed an opportunity because Gay Wilmore is really an important figure in the history of our church with respect to race relations, and it's unfortunate that we didn't have an opportunity to hear him speak. Now, that having been said, I want to go to his thought, and I want to focus on, as I have done in other presentations, one main issue. By the way, let me say there are a couple of wonderful books that he wrote that I think are worth pointing out to you, and some of you might even want to read these. One is a book called Black Religion and Black Radicalism. Black Religion and Black Radicalism, which is really a history, an overview of the relationship between religion and the race, the struggle for freedom, justice of the Black community. I'll talk more about that part of his work later. But the other is a book of essays called Pragmatic Spirituality, which is a wonderful collection of his writings on all kinds of things. Black consciousness, the ecumenical movement, this wonderful sermon to which I pointed about his relationship to his father and so forth. I want to commend those things to you. I can't possibly do justice to all the richness of what's contained in those, but I want to focus on, as I have with the others, the main strategic issue that confronted the Black community in his lifetime, or at least in the heart of his lifetime. And it was this issue. What's the relationship between the civil rights struggle, which was, above all, driven by Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience? That on the one hand, and the Black Power movement on the other. Let me say it again. The civil rights struggle, which is really comes to its you might say its greatest strength and influence in the first part of the 1960s and the 1960s, and then the Black Power movement, which comes into flourishes in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And it's right at that period, by the way, when Gay Wilmore is making up his mind about how long he's going to stay with the denomination that this issue comes to a head. And I think it's part of the background for his decision to turn into to become an academic. Most of the people in this gathering will remember reasonably well the flow of events in the 1960s, but let me just remind you of a few things so that we're all on the same page. There really were two fundamentally different chapters in the struggle of the 1960s with regard to race. Let me say that again. There were two different phases, two different chapters, very different chapters in the unfolding of that struggle in the 1960s. And I would say, if you want to sort of try to identify the point at which the turn takes place, it's this. It's after the passage of the Great Civil Rights Act. My own view is that the passage of the Civil Rights Act, an attempt, by the way, to recover some things which had been taken away in the segregation era. Reconstruction was an attempt to liberate Blacks, to empower Blacks, and all that was taken away. Most of it was taken away in the Jim Crow era. The Civil Rights Act was an attempt, in some respects, a heroic attempt to try to recover some of what had been lost. That was passed, and with a kind of big effort. It didn't happen quickly. It didn't happen easily. There was an enormous lobbying effort that took place, all kinds of horse trading on Capitol Hill. And as I said earlier, Humphrey and others indicated the role of the churches in that was not small at all. And I can remember, as a theological student in that period, the kind of excitement that came through the church as pastors in individual churches were deciding how they, as individuals, but also their churches, would respond to that challenge. So you get the passage of the Civil Rights Act, and in that period, there's a clear sense, there's data, public opinion data that shows this, that the mood of the country as a whole with regard to segregation was changing dramatically. There was a shift away from acceptance of segregation, especially as it was passed in the practiced in the South, away from accepting that as normal, as legitimate, more and more opposition to it. Once that happens, however, things begin to turn in a different direction. And part of that is because Martin Luther King and his forces connected around the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, not just King, but Abernathy and the rest of the civil rights leadership, other organizations, many of you know them well, the NAACP, the Urban League, and so forth. They were kind of united as a consortium in agreeing that once the worst, most obvious forms of segregation were being successfully addressed, including, by the way, throughout the South, the denial of voting. That's why voter registration campaigns were such an important part of it. They decided the time had come to move beyond, outside of that narrow civil rights legislation, to a wider range of issues, economic issues in particular, jobs, issues having to do with housing and jobs, and of course, all the issues connected with the war on poverty. And at the same time, to spread out, to move out this, to enlarge this campaign geographically, to move into northern cities and out into the West Coast. And the heart of this, you might say, to some extent in desperation, was the development of the Poor People's Campaign under certainly not just with the sanction of King, but with the active endorsement of King. As that movement takes place, and the issue suddenly becomes one that's national, where there is agitation for change on a lot of things that white people in other parts of the country, as well as the South, are attached to, there is a change in mood with regard to white attitudes concerning this struggle. The period of optimism, of widespread approval of it in the early 1950s increasingly fades away, and there's more and more white opposition and resistance. What Wilmore characterizes as backlash. He says backlash begins to set in. And of course, that was related to some other things. In particular, just a season of violence, not just in the South, but also riots, dozens of riots in all kinds of places. Again, to go back to the conversation I had with Gary Pinder about that point, right out of seminary, he was an assistant pastor at a large church in Dayton, Ohio, right down in the center of Dayton. And he said, he told me, I never will forget what a kind of turmoil there was in the church and in the wider community because of riots that had broken out in Dayton, Ohio. The Black community resisting certain things. And a lot of those riots were linked to what I would characterize as police misbehavior. Think, for example, of Rodney King and that famous riot that took place in Los Angeles. Well, as that explosion of riots, by the way, another place that's very interesting and related to the career of Joe Biden is the Wilmington riot that took place in that period. So there's a lot of rioting, and people are, and particularly in Black ghettos, things are being burned down. It's a time of real turbulence. And at the same time, there is sort of, you might say, the culmination of all this. When you think about all there's an intertwining of the civil rights struggle with the opposition to the Vietnam War, especially as Martin Luther King himself takes on an anti-war position, in a famous sermon, declares the Vietnam War to be an imperialist war. You just keep that in mind on Martin Luther King Day tomorrow. That was part of the legacy of Martin Luther King too. And in the midst of all that, you then get, of course, the assassination of Martin Luther King, which was, to put it mildly, a shock to the Black community, a shock to the Black community. Here is this great leader, symbolic of so much that had to do with the first phase of the struggle now being eliminated violently. And as that was unfolding, you get a reaction, a critical reaction to the philosophy of nonviolence, more broadly, the integrationist strategy with which King was associated, on the part of younger militants, younger Black militants in particular. There's an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, shorthand SNCC. By the way, that's where we get John Wilson, and that's where we get also a very important figure in this struggle, somebody called Stokely Carmichael, later changed his name. Stokely Carmichael is one of the authors of the term Black Power. And then, of course, the Black Panthers, who armed themselves to the teeth in order to demonstrate that if there was police misbehavior in their areas, they would respond violently. But I don't want to focus directly on that part of it. I want to instead focus mainly on the ideas. Another person, by the way, who was very important, prominently associated with this, is Angela Davis, the famous philosophy professor who was kind of a theoretician for the Black Power movement. Now, in order to get at what Wilmore's response to all of this was, I want to briefly summarize what I think is in his mind, the core of the Black Power philosophy, the Black Power idea. And it really does raise some very fundamental questions, which, by the way, had been in play in the Black community all along. Let me say that again. Issues which had been in play all along in the Black community over the years. I've tried to stress this. There were people proposing different strategies with regard to dealing with slavery. There were different strategies with regard to Jim Crow, and now you get, so to speak, another version of those same struggles. The Black Power proponents said the following: "Our goal should not be integration. Our goal should not be integration, at least not integration on white terms. The goal should be justice for Blacks." Let me say that again. Our goal should not be integration. And some of that reflected just a kind of loss of faith in the possibility of much goodwill among whites. Growing skepticism about whether whites really were serious about integration, especially integration on anything other than their terms. So the goal should not be integration. Who cares what the whites think? All we want is justice for Blacks. And of course, implied in that is an end to racism. Or another way to put it is to say, our goal should be Black empowerment. The use of the word power in the term Black power is not accidental. A lot of this turned on issues of power. The proponents of Black power said, even now, even as we have entered this period where we've got some civil rights legislation passed, still look at the power structures. The power structures are almost totally dominated by white people. And we as Black people have to be supplicants, going to, with hat in hand, to try to get some support from these white folks. They control everything. They control the major institutions, whether they be economic or educational. Even the churches are controlled by these white folks. And the only chance we've got of controlling anything is by creating our own separate institutions, like the Black churches. And even one of them said at one point, the only place that we've been able to control anything for the longest time has been the Black churches. In every other respect, American life is dominated by white people. And we have hardly any, not only are they controlled by white people, but we have hardly any voice in those institutions. Now, let me just say parenthetically here, we live in a different time where there are a lot of diversity sort of claims being made on the part of who's represented in what institutions. This is all pre that. This is a time when, for the most part, it was very hard to find a Black face in any important institution. So part of the Black power argument was, we need to have a place at the table. We need to have representation. And of course, that whole practice of excluding Blacks from any positions of real power and influence was obviously and implicitly racist, because it implied, for a variety of reasons, that they should not be there. But they also, the proponents of Black power, suggested the following: we need to demand and get what is rightfully ours. Now, I assure you, in any white setting, almost that kind of language is going to set people's teeth on edge. What do you mean, rightfully ours? And here's the argument, and it goes back to Henry Highland Garnett. It's not a new argument. We were deprived of something for a long time. Something was taken from us for which we have never been repaid. And so you get in the Black power movement this insistence that if justice is going to be done, we need to be repaid. There needs to be reparation for the harm that is done. Let's not just go on as though nothing has happened. We've got to recognize that a grave harm has been done and something needs to be done to rectify that. And only in that way are we going to get anything like a basis for true reconciliation and all that goes with that. And then, of course, the other thing that the Black power movement entailed was the following claim, which, by the way, you can just see pervasive evidence of this in our culture today. We need to develop in our own way with a pride in things Black. Black consciousness needs to be actively cultivated. Black solidarity needs to be actively cultivated. Black pride needs to be cultivated. We should not think of ourselves as people who have to just borrow from Western civilization as though Western civilization defines all that is good and right and wise. We should be able to develop our own institutions, our own ideas. We should be able to call on our own heritage from the past and take pride in the things which are Black. And if we're going to be woven into this society, it should be on terms which recognize our worth as Black people and the worth of our heritage. I could go on. That's just a brief summary, believe you me. Now, interestingly enough, when these ideas came into circulation in the late 1960s, they met with a lot of resistance in the Black community. Let me say that again. They met with a lot of resistance in the Black community because they were, in the minds of people who knew anything about Black history, a kind of return to Black separatism, which had been a theme all the way along in the great struggles that took place, especially at the turn of the century between Garvey and Du Bois and other people. There was a school of thought which said we Blacks, as much as possible, need to disengage from the wider society and be separate and pull ourselves apart. Well, this kind of represented a sort of version in the minds of many people of Black separatists. Now, the interesting thing is, most of the leadership of the Black establishment, including church leaders, Black churches, had long resisted that way of thinking. They thought that was wrong. They were proponents of integration. They were proponents of cooperation with the white community. They were proponents, and Martin Luther King's a good example of this, of white and Black together collaborating, working together towards a harmonious future. But the Black Power ideas, and by the way, once these ideas were out there, on the whole, the Black denominations stoutly resisted them and actively criticized them. The top leadership of the major Black denominations openly criticized this. One of the leaders of the National Baptist Convention, the Black Convention, said, "This is racist. This is reverse racist." But these ideas appealed to many younger Blacks, especially, and this is going to be very interesting to you, especially Blacks who had grown up and lived in the mainline white denominations. Let me say that again. It was far more appealing to people who had grown up in the major white denominations than people who'd grown up in the AME Zion Church. Why would that be? Well, when you think about it, it computes perfectly. Remember what Grimke said? Grimke said, "I have confronted more racism in the church than outside." So, and by the way, Wilmore becomes one of these people. Wilmore is one of these people who is sympathetic to these Black Power ideas. And he says, in part, I'm in this position because I've grown up in this mainline white Protestant world, and I know what these people are like, quote unquote. You know, they'll talk a good game, but when it comes down to it, they're not going to be sort of solidly on our side. So as a result of that, Gay Wilmore played an active role in the creation of the Black Caucus in the Presbyterian world, which exists to this day. I referred earlier to a Black Caucus that's sponsoring an event next week in our presbytery, and that's been a consistent pattern ever since. A Black Caucus in each of the major Protestant, predominantly white denominations. And he also played a significant role in the National Conference of Black Churchmen, which published a whole page advertisement in the New York Times in 1966, arguing for the defensibility, the legitimacy of Black Power ideas. By the way, all this happens before the emergence of books that are characterized as books in Black theology. This is sort of the preparation for what becomes Black theology, about which I will speak next week. I'm going to be talking about that in connection with the work of several figures, including mainly Katie Cannon. Now, I know I'm pushing the envelope here in terms of time, but let me now go to the most important thing I have to say, which is Gay Wilmore's the summary of his own views on this whole topic of Black Power. And I want to try to do this as deliberately and precisely as I can. He said, first of all, it is a false dichotomy to juxtapose the philosophy of Martin Luther King over against the philosophy of Black Power. It is a false dichotomy. And he said, I really deeply resent the way in which not only the media, quote unquote, have adopted that way of talking about the issue, but the way in which so often white churchmen have then gone along with that formulation in their own reaction to this phenomenon. Well, why would it not be? Martin Luther, and by the way, Martin Luther King himself had critical things occasionally to say about Black Power. So there was some justification to that, but Wilmore himself pushed back against this and said, it's wrong to think of these as opposites or enemies of one another. Why would that be? He said, I agree with Martin Luther King, absolutely, that our goal should be a truly desegregated society, a truly desegregated society in which, and we all know the famous phrasing of the I have a dream speech, a truly desegregated society would be one in which race did not matter. Remember, the color of skin does not matter. That's exactly what we want. A society in which everyone is treated fairly, everyone is treated with respect, regardless of race. That of course, that's our ambition. That's our goal. But he said, I don't think, as a Black man, that can be achieved without Black empowerment. That can't be achieved without, and above all, it means putting Blacks in some positions of leadership in our society so that they can have a real say in the way things are done. He said, in the absence of Black empowerment, real empowerment, what's going to be the case always is that Blacks will be treated as second-class or third-class citizens, and more important, they will think of themselves that way. He said, this is a deep cultural problem. Unless there is a reversal, somehow fundamental change in the power dynamics in our society, Blacks will always think of themselves as second-class or third-class citizens. For now, he said, therefore, it is terribly important that there actually be a heightening of racial consciousness and awareness. He said, many whites want to say, let's forget about race. Let's just drop that altogether. He said, no. In order to get where we want to go, there needs now to be actually a heightening of racial consciousness. And related to that, there need to be special efforts made to undo the harms that have been done in the past. Let me say that again. Special efforts need to be made to undo the harms that have been done in the past. So he was a proponent of affirmative action. He was a proponent of reparations and all those things which were designed to rectify the injustices that had been done in the past. And clearly, from the point of view of critics, that was what? Singling out some one group for special attention by virtue of their race. And as far as Wilmore was concerned, that was absolutely the right thing to do and the necessary thing to do if things were going to really change. The future, he said, if things go well, will indeed eventually be a post-racial society. He was one of the first, in my reading, to use that phrase. The future eventually will be a post-racial society. But for now, he said, it is crazy to think that we can ignore race. We really got to understand that there is a problem here that has to be directly addressed. It's not just going to happen. It's not just going to change on its own. And then he said, and this is entering into the last phase of what I want to say about him. He said at one point, and more than once, but toward especially in his later writing, he said, you know, what we're saying here, as I read the Black Power argument, it's what the Black churches have always said. And that was kind of ironic because they were opposed to Black Power. But he said, this has been the voice of the Black community all along. He said, and at one point he even says, I recall the memory of Henry Highland Garnett when I say da 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 da. This is something we've been arguing right from the start. These things are wrong and they need to be rectified. And the only way that we're going to solve this problem is by directly confronting it. Two final comments about him, and I realize I've used up literally all the time, but here comes the two final observations. When he turned to his academic career, something really interesting happened, and I've never fully understood why it happened. He was trained as an ethicist, a social ethicist specifically, and his first teaching, Gary Pinder's experience, was teaching ethics courses. But when he migrated to the back to the academy after all those years in the life of the denomination, he turned to church history and became a church historian. And his whole scholarly career, from the time that he entered the academy in the 1970s until the end of it, was devoted to trying to, and here's, I think this is related to all the things I've been saying. He said, one of the most important things that needs to happen in the Black world, and I'm contributing my part to it in the life of the church, we Blacks need to recover a true and authentic sense of what the history actually has been. And in particular, he fought against the notion that Black religion was just white man's religion that had been successfully imposed upon the Blacks to keep them down. He said, the real story of Black religion is resistance, resistance, resistance by whatever means we could find. So he's trying to recover that sort of style of way of thinking about, and by the way, very successfully, is especially the book to which I referred on Black radicalism became an important resource in the rethinking of the role of religion in the Black experience. The other thing that happened was that in 1970, a man called Cone, James Cone, a Baptist, Black Baptist, teaching at Union Theological Seminary in New York, published a book called A Black Theology of Liberation. This was Black theology. This was the first real sort of fulsome expression of it. The book was a very controversial volume, very influential book. He and Cohn once the book was out, Wilmore and Cohn became friends and collaborators, and Wilmore became, in the last phase of his life, an exponent of this Black theology. And the obvious question is, well, what is Black theology? What's the justification for it? Stay tuned. You'll hear about that next week.
So I think that is probably all the time we have for today. My suggestion is that we save questions or maybe send them to Bruce so that he can continue them. I think you all have his address. If not, you have mine or Allison's, and we can pass them on.